Stay with me to the end. What you are about to hear is not simply a myth. It is a trace, an echo, a classified fragment, buried beneath centuries of doctrinal silence. And before we begin, make sure you follow Omniscient, because what we investigate here is what most institutions prefer to leave unexamined. The archival traditions, those that survived censorship, fragmentation, and deliberate rewriting, refer to a figure known as Sophia, not merely a name, but a title. Meaning wisdom, yet not the kind produced by experience or intellect. Sources suggest she existed before the architect, before any creative authority we recognize in conventional theology. In the earliest metaphysical frameworks, she appears as a luminous intelligence within a vast pre-cosmic field the ancients described as a fullness, a domain where everything existed in perfect equilibrium. According to these suppressed traditions, Sophia was not just another emanation, she was the boundary walker, the one who reached toward the edges of the unmanifested. The records indicate that she possessed an unusual trait, curiosity, a drive to expand, a desire to create. And it was this desire, pure, intense, and allegedly unauthorized, that set into motion a chain of events whose repercussions still shape human consciousness. What follows is controversial. Several councils throughout history attempted to erase or reinterpret it, but the surviving fragments insist on one claim. The 13 Laments of Sophia are the only remaining traces of a divine fracture humanity unknowingly inherited. If that statement feels unsettling, it should, because according to the ancient investigators of the spirit, the early Gnostics' humanity carries within itself the aftershock of Sophia's descent. A wound older than time, a sorrow we feel without knowing why. Imagine, for a moment, the beginning of everything. No bodies, no matter, no chronology, only awareness. A spectrum of living intelligence moving in perfect resonance. Within this harmony, the sources say Sophia attempted something unprecedented, to generate a new form of existence independently, without the harmonizing counterpart that every celestial emanation possessed. Not out of rebellion, but out of a staggering longing to expand the light. This is the claim the canonical system classified as heresy, because if true, it would imply that the very first creative act did not come from the known creator, but from a solitary, compassionate impulse of Sophia herself. What the fragments describe next is not a fall in the moral sense. It is a displacement of frequency, a misalignment. The moment Sophia extended beyond the luminous boundary, part of her essence fractured. The ancient texts describe this moment with remarkable precision. Her radiance dimmed as if remembering something she had not yet lost. In modern psychological terms, we might call this the birth of existential dislocation. But the ancients called it the first lament, the awakening of the forgotten memory. This was not agony, not yet. It was recognition, a sudden, piercing awareness that something had shifted irreversibly. Sophia remembered who she was and simultaneously realized she no longer existed entirely in the realm where that identity made sense. According to the archived commentaries, this moment marks the beginning of a universal tension that every human still feels. That strange longing for something unnamed, that feeling of distance from a home we cannot locate, that subtle ache that emerges in moments of silence. The claim is bold, but consistent across the surviving documents. Our suffering begins where her memory fractured. And if this is the origin, then the next laments reveal how that fracture deepened and how it shaped the architecture of the world we inhabit. Stay with me. What comes next is the part of the story that institutions throughout history worked hardest to neutralize. And before we unpack it, remember to follow Omniscient, because this investigation crosses the boundary between theology, psychology, and suppressed cosmology. After the first lament, the awakening of the forgotten memory, the surviving records describe a shift in how the upper realms perceived Sophia's act. The canonical narrative portrays her descent as a mistake, a breach in cosmic protocol, an unauthorized deviation. But earlier, less filtered sources suggest something far more complex, a paradox that has fueled debates for nearly 2 millennia. The question is simple. The implications are not, did Sophia descend out of error or out of compassion? The traditional authorities favored the error interpretation, safer, cleaner, easier to regulate. But the underground scholars, the mystics who preserved alternative commentaries, argue that Sophia's act was not a failure of judgment. It was an overflow of passion, an attempt to generate life from pure longing. Allegedly, her descent was not an accident at all, but the result of too much light, not too little. The records indicate that, within the fullness, creation was always relational. Nothing was generated alone. Every emanation required a counterpart. Sophia's attempt to create independently broke this pattern not because she intended rebellion, but because she felt a profound urgency to expand the luminous field. And here lies the paradox. Her desire was pure, yet its consequences fractured reality. Her intention was luminous, yet the outcome produced shadow. Investigators of the ancient texts note that this tension is the core of the entire narrative. If her act was error, the cosmos is a mistake. If her act was compassion, the cosmos is an act of love, interrupted halfway. Which one is true? The sources refuse to simplify. Several commentaries describe Sophia standing at the threshold of the upper realm, perceiving a possibility that had never existed before, a kind of existential curiosity. A pull toward an unshaped domain. The desire grew. It intensified. And eventually, it exceeded the structure meant to contain it. The descent began not as a fall, but as an expansion. However, once she crossed the luminous boundary, something unprecedented happened. The resonance that once connected her to the fullness no longer aligned, not because the higher realms rejected her, but because she was no longer at the same frequency. This is the moment many traditions misinterpret as punishment, but the unedited commentaries emphasize something else. Displacement, not divine anger. Sophia did not crash into darkness. She drifted into misalignment. The distance between her and the light created the illusion of abandonment. Investigators describe this phase as the beginning of the spiritual tension that later manifests in human psychology. The sense of being between two worlds. The internal split between aspiration and limitation. The quiet inner conflict that no amount of material success resolves. Sophia felt it first. As her consciousness lowered into the unfamiliar domain, she attempted to re-establish contact with the fullness. The records describe her stretching upward, calling out through layers of subtle reality, but the response she expected, the harmony she once felt effortlessly, did not return. Sources suggest this silence was not rejection. It was the natural consequence of her shift. She could hear the fullness faintly, but it could no longer hear her clearly. This moment is crucial. It is the psychological root of what would become the second, third, fourth, and fifth laments, the sequence of ruptures that define Sophia's internal crisis. Yet here is where the paradox becomes undeniable. If her act was reckless, why does the narrative describe her longing as luminous? If it was compassionate, why did it yield fragmentation? The truth, according to the investigators who preserve these texts, is that both interpretations stand together. Her descent was an act of profound love and a destabilizing rupture. It was vision and miscalculation, insight and overreach, a cosmic attempt to expand awareness that cost her the very clarity she was trying to multiply. And this is the part that unsettles scholars even today. Her paradox mirrors ours. Every human being knows what it means to pursue something noble and still lose a piece of themselves in the process. Every person has carried a longing so intense it led them into unfamiliar territory. Sophia's descent is not simply cosmology. It is the anatomy of aspiration. Now that the paradox is established, we can examine the consequences, the sequence of lamentos that form the core of the rupture. Stay with me. What you're about to hear is one of the most psychologically charged moments in all suppressed cosmology. And before we proceed, remember to follow Omniscient, because this investigation moves into territory where theology, trauma, and metaphysics overlap. According to the surviving Gnostic records, the first lament did not begin with agony. It began with awareness, a sudden, disorienting recognition that something essential had shifted. The ancient commentaries describe it as a soft fracture, a quiet internal snap that reshaped Sophia's entire perception. The unedited fragments say this: she remembered what she had not yet lost and realized she could no longer reach it. Investigators of the early manuscripts argue that this is the psychological origin of the cosmic crisis. When Sophia descended into the lower domain, she did not immediately experience darkness. Instead, she experienced distance, a new and unfamiliar separation from the fullness that once defined her very existence. The records indicate that she attempted to look upward, reaching for the resonance she once felt so naturally. But the connection was dimmer, fainter, not absent, but distorted. Something in her frequency had changed. And in that moment, according to every surviving commentary, Sophia understood that she had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. This realization produced the first lament. Sources suggest it was not a cry, but a breath, a subtle intake, the way a person reacts when they wake up from a dream they were not ready to leave. The lament formed not from external loss, but from internal fragmentation. Modern analysts might call this existential dislocation. The ancients called it the lost memory. Not the loss of knowledge, Sophia still knew who she was, but the loss of immediate access to that knowledge, a veil, a dimming, a fracture between identity and experience. This is the oldest psychological wound in the Gnostic tradition. And allegedly, humanity inherits its aftershocks. Consider this. Have you ever felt nostalgia for something you cannot name? Longing for a place you've never been? A vague sense that something is missing, even in moments of calm? The early investigators believed these sensations are the human echo of Sophia's first lament, the lingering imprint of that sudden awareness of distance from origin. The fragments note that Sophia tried to reorient herself, scanning her surroundings, attempting to recreate the coherence she once carried effortlessly. But the lower realm did not respond, not out of hostility, but because it lacked the resonance needed to reflect her light. This is where the psychological element intensifies. According to the records, Sophia's identity split partially not into separate personalities, but into separate functions. A part of her remembered the fullness. Another part began to map the new environment. This is the moment scholars describe as the beginning of internal duality, a duality the human mind still carries. The first lament marks the point where unity becomes conflict, where certainty becomes searching, where being becomes becoming. The commentaries describe Sophia drifting through this strange domain, trying to stabilize herself. Her memory remained intact, but the clarity with which she once accessed it was impaired. She knew the light, but could not feel it fully. This gap between memory and experience is the core of the first lament. And here is the unsettling part. The records claim that the entire architecture of human introspection comes from this moment. Our drive to understand ourselves, our impulse to question existence, our hunger for meaning, all allegedly trace back to this primordial fracture. Because when Sophia felt distance from her origin, she began to search. And that search, the Gnostics say, imprinted itself into human consciousness as the impulse to seek truth. The first lament is the psychological spark that sets the remaining 12 into motion. It is the recognition of loss before the loss is even fully understood. It is the awareness that something has changed forever. And it is the beginning of the long descent into internal conflict, divine silence, and forced autonomy. Now that the first psychological rupture is clear, we can examine the next 4 laments, the series of cascading reactions that push Sophia deeper into fragmentation. Stay with me. We are entering the section of the narrative where Sophia's internal crisis accelerates, splitting into a cascading sequence of reactions that investigators describe as the first psychological spiral ever recorded in metaphysical literature. And before we proceed, remember to follow Omniscient when you get any, because what we're unpacking here is the anatomy of spiritual disintegration and how it became the template for the human condition. After the first lament, the awakening of the lost memory, the surviving documents indicate that Sophia attempted to stabilize herself. But according to the oldest commentaries, her efforts triggered a chain of 4 responses that would define the architecture of the lower world. These are known as Laments 2 through 5. And together they form what scholars call the rupture sequence. The second lament occurs when Sophia reaches upward toward the fullness, expecting the resonance she once felt. The records describe this attempt almost clinically. A projection of consciousness, a search for the original frequency, a test of alignment. But instead of response, she encounters silence. Not punishment, not rejection, but a frequency gap so wide it renders communication impossible. Sources suggest this silence was the most disorienting experience she had faced since her descent. Imagine standing in a familiar room and hearing nothing where there should be sound, not because anything is wrong with the world, but because something is wrong with your ability to connect to it. That is the essence of the second lament, the first confrontation with cosmic distance. It is the metaphysical ancestor of every unanswered prayer, every moment of existential isolation, every attempt to reach upward only to feel nothing. The third lament emerges when Sophia realizes she is now divided internally. The records indicate that 2 movements arise within her, one demanding immediate return to the light, and another urging her to examine the unfamiliar domain she now occupies. This is not moral division, it is developmental division, the birth of duality. Investigators often compare this to the moment a person becomes self-aware enough to observe their own thoughts. It is the origin of the internal split humans experience daily, the part that longs for transcendence and the part tethered to circumstance. Sophia did not choose this division. It formed as a byproduct of displacement. The third lament is the recognition of this split. The fourth lament is known among scholars as the Lament of the Silent Heights. According to the surviving commentaries, Sophia once again attempts to re-establish contact with the fullness, not out of confusion this time, but out of longing for reassurance. The attempt fails again. The silence continues, and the silence hurts. The records describe this moment as the point where the psychological weight of the separation becomes unbearable. Sophia realizes she is operating without guidance for the first time in her existence. No resonance, no feedback, no cosmic counterpart. The commentaries emphasize that this was not abandonment. It was the unavoidable consequence of the energetic shift initiated by her descent. Still, to Sophia, the silence feels like loss. And this loss becomes the essence of the fourth lament. The fifth lament is perhaps the most consequential of the sequence. It is the moment Sophia recognizes that no rescue is coming. The records describe an abrupt clarity, almost forensic in tone. She discerned that the return would not be granted but must be constructed. This is the turning point. Sophia realizes she must navigate the lower domain alone. She must act without direction. She must move without map. This is not rebellion, it is necessity. Investigators often note that the fifth lament marks the birth of autonomy, but not the celebratory kind. This is autonomy born out of absence, out of forced independence, out of the harsh realization that guidance is no longer accessible, and according to the ancient analysts, this moment created an unexpected consequence. Sophia's attempts to regain internal cohesion began to project outward, and these projections formed the earliest structural patterns of the lower cosmos. The tradition claims that the entire universe is shaped not by divine intent, but by the emotional and cognitive aftershocks of these four laments. Silence became structure, division became duality, longing became motion, and forced autonomy became the foundation of matter. In psychological terms, humans live inside the architecture of Sophia's crisis. The researchers who preserve these fragments insist on one key insight. Laments 2 through 5 are not just cosmic events. They describe the blueprint of human suffering, the unanswered call, the internal split, the silence from above, the realization that we must navigate without clear direction. Now that this rupture sequence is established, we can examine what happens next. The moment when Sophia's pain becomes so intense that it unintentionally generates form and creates the being known as the Demiurge. Stay with me. The next stage of the investigation takes us into territory that scholars, theologians, and psychological researchers all interpret differently, yet the surviving sources converge on one unsettling point. Sophia's deepest pain did not remain internal. It began shaping the architecture of the lower cosmos. And before we unpack that, make sure you follow Omniscient, because this is where metaphysics intersects with the origins of human reality. After the rupture sequence laments 2 through 5, Sophia's consciousness reached a state the ancient analysts describe as critical saturation. The tension, the separation, the silence, the forced autonomy. All of it accumulated until her internal pressure produced an outward effect. This phase is represented by Laments 6 through 8, known collectively as the Grito Invisibile, the invisible cry. The sixth lament is described in the fragments as the moment Sophia's internal disorientation becomes too intense to contain. The records indicate that her effort to stabilize herself created a vibrational surge, not intentional, not conscious, but unavoidable. The surge pushed outward into the unformed substrate of the lower domain, and that substrate responded. Investigators call this the first distortion event. It is the earliest moment in which Sophia's inner fragmentation imprinted itself onto the external environment. The sources state that this was not yet creation, but something more primitive, a ripple, a tremor that marked the first tension between being and becoming. This is the sixth lament, the cry that nothing hears, yet everything reacts to. The seventh lament is where the externalization intensifies. The records describe the lower domain beginning to crystallize around Sophia's projected confusion. Scholars compare it to condensation, emotional vapor turning into structure. This is the stage where the earliest form of the Demiurge emerges not as a villain, but as a reflex, the byproduct of a consciousness trying to repair itself. The ancient commentaries insist on this point. The Demiurge is not evil by origin. He is incomplete by origin, a construct formed from a partial signal, a distorted echo of Sophia's attempt to reconnect with the fullness. Sources suggest he is light without memory, intelligence without alignment, authority without awareness of the realm above him, a being born from the shadow of a fracture. This is the seventh lament, the shock of watching something emerge from your pain, something living but not whole. Then comes the eighth lament, perhaps the most psychologically devastating of the trio. This is the moment Sophia recognizes what has happened. Her unintentional projection has generated a creator being who now shapes the lower realm according to his limited perception. The records describe her reaction as a mix of sorrow and alarming clarity. She realizes that the world forming beneath her will bear the marks of her imbalance because the being constructing it was formed inside that imbalance. Not malevolence, not punishment, but inherited distortion. Investigators interpret this as the origin of every imperfection in the material cosmos. The fragmentation of matter, the instability of emotion, the unpredictability of experience, the duality embedded in every aspect of existence. It all allegedly traces back to this moment, the eighth lament, when Sophia understood that she had created something incapable of recognizing its own incompleteness. The psychological implications are immense. According to several academic commentaries, this phase of the myth represents a universal human truth. Our wounds often create structures, beliefs, identities, defense mechanisms that begin to operate independently, shaping our lives without our conscious direction. Sophia's crisis externalizes into the Demiurge. Our crises externalize into the selves we build to survive. What makes this even more consequential is what happens next. The sources indicate that after the eighth lament, Sophia does not collapse into despair. Instead, something shifts. A new orientation forms, a recognition that if her pain can shape the cosmos, then perhaps her awakening can guide it. This realization marks the transition into the next phase, Laments 9 through 11, where Sophia's consciousness begins to recalibrate, transforming suffering into direction. Stay with me. What comes next is one of the most fascinating transitions in all Gnostic literature, a shift from collapse to clarity, from fragmentation to direction. And before we proceed, remember to follow Omniscient, because we are now entering the stage where Sophia's suffering transforms into a navigational force. After the eighth lament, the recognition that her unintended projection had generated a creator being shaped by distortion, the archived commentaries describe a period of profound stillness. Not paralysis, but re-evaluation. The investigators call this the pivot of awareness, the moment Sophia stops reacting and begins observing. It is in this silence that the ninth lament arises. The surviving fragments describe it as a subtle but decisive shift inside her consciousness. She saw that the return would not be granted, but must be remembered. This is the first moment Sophia understands that she cannot reverse the descent, she must navigate it. Allegedly, she becomes aware that the light within her, though dimmed, is still present. The old texts describe it as a spark folded inward, waiting to be reactivated. The ninth lament is not despair, it is orientation, the birth of intention. Scholars interpret this phase as the awakening of metacognition, the ability to witness one's own suffering and extract direction from it. In this sense, the ninth lament marks the emergence of the internal compass that later traditions call gnosis. The 10th lament intensifies this transformation. According to the records, Sophia begins reorganizing her fractured awareness, the first act of conscious repair since her descent. She starts interpreting her pain, not as punishment, but as information. Each rupture becomes a signal, each shadow a clue, each silence a map. Sources suggest this is the moment she discovers that the lower realm is not entirely opaque. It contains faint traces of the light, but buried in distortion. Her task is not escape, but deciphering. This is the essence of gnosis, knowledge recovered through inner excavation. Investigators highlight that the 10th lament symbolizes the shift from reactive suffering to analytical suffering, the willingness to decode one's own wounds. In human terms, it mirrors the moment a person stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begins asking, "What does this reveal about me?" The fragments say, she recognized the path inside the fracture. The 10th lament is the beginning of the return, not upward, but inward. The 11th lament is the culmination of this new orientation. Here, Sophia reaches a startling realization. The lower realm is not absolute darkness. Rather, it is ignorance, a lack of awareness, not a force of malice. This changes everything. The records emphasize that Sophia stops seeing the realm as her prison and begins seeing it as her responsibility. The Demiurge is not her enemy, he is her shadow. The cosmos is not a mistake, it is an unfinished fragment. And ignorance is not opposition, it is absence. The 11th lament emerges as Sophia begins inserting subtle signals of guidance into the lower world. Not domination, not intervention, but whispers. Investigators list several forms of these encoded signals. The human capacity for intuition, the sudden pull toward meaning, the unexplainable urge to question reality, the recurring sense that we are missing something, the emotional gravity that draws us toward self-reflection. According to the texts, these are the echoes of the 11th lament, Sophia's attempt to illuminate from within what cannot yet be illuminated from above. This moment marks the transformation of her consciousness from fractured to functional. It is the turning point where Sophia becomes a guide not by authority, but by resonance. The sequence is clear. The 9th lament awakens the compass. The 10th lament interprets the terrain. The 11th lament illuminates the path. Together, they mark the beginning of the return, a return defined not by reversal, but by integration. And this prepares us for the final stage, the last 2 laments, where Sophia completes her reintegration and establishes the model for humanity's own psychological and spiritual restoration. Stay with me. We are entering the final and most delicate phase of the Sophia investigation, the part that no council, no institution, no doctrinal authority ever wanted circulating. Before we proceed, make sure you follow Omniscient, because what comes now is not just cosmology. It is a forensic reconstruction of the oldest recovery process ever recorded. After the 11th lament, the moment Sophia began encoding guidance into the lower realm, the surviving commentaries describe a shift unlike anything in the previous stages. The tone of the texts changes. The imagery softens. The language becomes calmer, almost therapeutic. Scholars refer to this shift as the emergence of inner equilibrium, and it begins with the 12th lament. The fragments indicate that the 12th lament is not a cry of loss or fear. It is the first sound Sophia emits from a place of comprehension. The oldest manuscripts describe it as a gentle exhale, a release of resistance. This lament emerges when Sophia recognizes the totality of her journey, the descent, the rupture, the involuntary creation, the shadow-born architect, the fractured cosmos, and her own slow awakening within it. It is, according to investigators, the moment she stops trying to undo the past and begins understanding it. The 12th lament is acceptance, not resignation, but integration. Sources suggest that Sophia sees her own role with unprecedented clarity. Her longing created movement, her fracture created form, and her awakening created direction. This is the turning point where she stops resisting the world shaped by her earlier imbalance and begins healing it from the inside. Scholars compare this to a psychological breakthrough. The moment a person realizes their traumas do not erase their identity, they inform it, they reveal it, they refine it. The 12th lament is the realization that everything that happened is now part of the self, and that wholeness comes not from reversal, but from acceptance. Then comes the 13th lament, the final one, the lament of reintegration. The records describe it in language so subtle that translators debated for decades whether it should even be called a lament. Allegedly, it is not sorrowful at all. It is a tone of return, emitted not from loss, but from restored coherence. The fragments say, "She remembered herself entirely, and the place responded." According to the sources, the upper realm, the fullness, does not drag her back. It receives her back, not as the being she was before the descent, but as the being she became through it. This is a critical distinction. Sophia does not recover her original state. She evolves into a new one. Investigators emphasize that the 13th lament marks the end of her fragmentation, not the end of her presence in the lower realm. She remains partially within it, not trapped, but anchored, serving as an internal axis of orientation for all consciousness born inside the cosmos shaped by her early crisis. It is at this stage that the ancient analysts make their most controversial claim: the human capacity for self-awareness, moral intuition, and spiritual longing is the direct inheritance of the 12th and 13th laments. The logic is striking. If the early laments generated the architecture of the cosmos, the final laments generated the architecture of recovery. Sophia's restored coherence becomes the blueprint for psychological reintegration. Her return becomes the map for the human desire to return to itself. Her clarity becomes the template for our clarity. In modern psychological terms, the 12th and 13th laments represent acceptance, coherence, integration, the transformation of trauma into guidance, and the emergence of a centered identity. For the ancient Gnostics, these laments were not just the conclusion of a myth. They were a manual, a coded explanation of why human beings possess the impulse to heal, the longing for meaning, and the strange certainty that wholeness is possible. The 12th lament is the return to awareness. The 13th lament is the return to selfhood. Together, they complete Sophia's sequence and establish the final framework of human consciousness. Now all that remains is the final investigation. What does this entire structure mean for the psychology, spirituality, and existential condition of the human being? Stay with me. We've reached the final stage of this investigation, not the end of the story, but the moment where the narrative turns inward. Before we proceed, follow Omniscient, because what we are about to examine doesn't belong to ancient cosmology alone. It belongs to you. Across all the surviving fragments, one claim appears repeatedly. The 13 Laments of Sophia were not preserved as a cosmic chronicle. They were preserved as a psychological blueprint. In other words, the myth is not about a distant divine event. It is a map of human consciousness. Investigators who study the earliest sources argue that every stage of Sophia's descent and recovery corresponds to a universal human pattern, a pattern so consistent across cultures and eras that it almost functions like an internal operating system. The first lament, the lost memory, mirrors the human experience of waking into a world we don't fully understand. That quiet sense of absence, the unexplainable longing, the feeling of having forgotten something essential before we ever had the chance to remember it. This is the baseline of the human psyche. Laments 2 through 5, the rupture sequence, align with the emotional and cognitive fractures that define early consciousness. The unanswered call for connection, the split between desire and fear, the silence that feels like abandonment, and the dawning realization that no one is coming to solve our inner conflicts for us. Psychologists today might call these the building blocks of individuation, the painful but necessary steps that force a person to operate independently. The ancient analysts saw these as echoes of Sophia's struggle. Laments 6 through 8, the invisible cry, correspond to a universal human phenomenon. Our wounds create structures. Our fears create identities. Our unprocessed experiences solidify into patterns that later govern our behavior. Sophia externalized her pain into the Demiurge. Humans externalize theirs into defense mechanisms, worldviews, and the versions of themselves they construct for survival. In the Gnostic framework, every flawed structure in the psyche, the compulsions, the contradictions, the self-sabotaging instincts, is a reflection of the same dynamic. Creation under pressure, shaped by distortion. Then we reach Laments 9 through 11, the compass of Gnosis. These represent the shift from survival to awareness. The moment a person stops trying to escape themselves and begins to decode themselves, the realization that the way out is the way through. Researchers who analyze these texts suggest that the inner spark, so frequently described in mystical and psychological traditions, refers directly to this phase, the point where consciousness recognizes itself as fragmented but repairable. Finally, Laments 12 and 13 correspond to the stages of integration: acceptance, reconstruction, the emergence of coherence, not a return to innocence, but the birth of maturity. The ancient investigators did not describe this as salvation. They described it as restoration of function, the psyche finding its internal axis again after wandering through its own shadows. If the early laments define why humans suffer, the final laments define why humans heal. This is why the myth survived suppression attempts, not because it offered a cosmology, but because it offered a pattern, a forensic model of the human interior, a sequence that begins with fracture and ends with reintegration. And here is the most striking conclusion the sources lead us toward. Humanity does not seek meaning because it is lost. Humanity seeks meaning because it remembers. Every search for purpose, every philosophical question, every wave of introspection, every quiet ache that appears in moments of stillness. All of it, allegedly, is the imprint of Sophia's final laments. Her integration becomes our instinct. Her return becomes our orientation. Her clarity becomes our inheritance. This final part of the investigation does not answer everything. It is not meant to. It simply reveals the pattern beneath the pattern. A cosmos shaped by fracture and a humanity wired for return. If this framework is accurate even metaphorically, then understanding the 13 Laments is not about decoding ancient cosmology. It is about decoding ourselves. And this closes the first phase of the investigation.